Gypsy Rose Blanchard. In June 2015, sheriff's deputies in Greene County, Missouri, were dispatched to investigate a disturbing situation. A Facebook post had appeared on the shared account of Dee Dee Blanchard and her daughter Gypsy Rose. It read, "That ___ is dead." A second comment followed, more chilling than the first. ___ slashed that fat pig and raped her innocent daughter. Alarmed friends contacted authorities. When officers entered the Blanchard residence in Springfield, they found a horrific scene. Dee Dee, 48 years old, was discovered stabbed to death in her bed, her torso carved with wounds, her body partially covered by a sheet. Even more alarming, her daughter Gypsy, believed to be terminally ill and wheelchair-bound, was nowhere to be found. Police feared the worst: a vulnerable, disabled girl abducted after her mother's brutal murder. But within 48 hours, the case unraveled into something no one could have predicted. Gypsy wasn't missing. She wasn't disabled. In fact, she wasn't even sick. She had planned the killing. For years, Dee Dee had deceived the world into believing her daughter suffered from leukemia, muscular dystrophy, epilepsy, and a host of other fabricated illnesses. She shaved Gypsy's head, confined her to a wheelchair, forced her to use feeding tubes, and subjected her to unnecessary medications and surgeries. This was Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a psychological disorder where a caregiver invents or induces illness to control someone and gain sympathy. Dee Dee excelled at manipulation. She won donations, free trips, and even a new home through Habitat for Humanity by convincing charities and neighbors that Gypsy was a gravely ill child. Behind closed doors, however, Gypsy endured a life of torment. Dee Dee micromanaged her every move, keeping her malnourished, infantilized, and utterly isolated. When Gypsy tried to rebel, Dee Dee retaliated with beatings, threats, and even restraints. Friends later described Gypsy as less a daughter and more a prisoner, trapped in her own home. By her late teens, Gypsy began piecing together the truth. She could walk. She didn't need the medications her mother forced upon her. She wasn't sick at all. But her attempts to assert independence were crushed by Dee Dee's suffocating grip. Then, in 2012, Gypsy met Nicholas Godejohn, a socially awkward man from Wisconsin she encountered on a Christian dating site. He suffered from his own mental health issues and harbored dark sexual fantasies. For Gypsy, he became her lifeline, someone who believed her, someone who offered escape. By 2015, their secret relationship had spiraled into a deadly conspiracy. Gypsy persuaded Godejohn to travel to Missouri. Armed with a knife, he entered the Blanchard home while Dee Dee slept. Gypsy hid in the bathroom, covering her ears as Nicholas stabbed her mother more than a dozen times. Dee Dee died in her bed. Afterward, Gypsy and Nicholas fled to Wisconsin, leaving behind a gruesome scene. It didn't take long for police to trace the shocking Facebook posts back to Nicholas's home. When they found Gypsy, she was not the frail, dying girl the world believed her to be. She was walking, alive, and healthier than anyone imagined. The revelation stunned the public. The trial became a media firestorm. Nicholas was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Gypsy's case was more complex. She had conspired to kill her mother, yet she was undeniably a victim of years of psychological and physical abuse. Her lawyers argued she saw no other way to break free. In 2016, she accepted a plea deal for second-degree murder and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The case sparked heated debate. Was Gypsy a murderer? Or was she an abused child finally reclaiming her life the only way she knew how? Documentaries, dramatizations, and podcasts dissected every detail, forcing the world to grapple with the blurred line between victim and perpetrator. Lizzie Andrew Borden. Lizzie Andrew Borden was 32 years old when her identity became permanently engraved into American criminal folklore. Charged with executing her father and stepmother within their Fall River, Massachusetts residence, her case would become one of history's most debated mysteries. Born into a prosperous yet penny-pinching household, Lizzie's upbringing was dominated by rigid religious doctrine and austere living conditions despite her father's substantial wealth. Andrew Borden was a thriving entrepreneur, but his decision to maintain the family within a basic, deteriorating home lacking indoor plumbing on the ground levels created persistent friction between him and his daughters, Lizzie and Emma. Their relationship with their stepmother Abby remained perpetually tense and uncomfortable. Lizzie refused to acknowledge her as a maternal figure, instead addressing her coldly as Mrs. Borden. During the months preceding the murders, family discord intensified dramatically. Arguments over property ownership and inheritance rights fostered deep resentment, culminating in a deeply disturbing incident. Andrew's brutal slaughter of Lizzie's beloved pet pigeons using a hatchet created lasting bitterness that poisoned the household atmosphere. Contributing to the mounting unease, every member of the household had experienced mysterious illness episodes during the days before the murders, causing Abby to fear possible deliberate poisoning attempts. On the sweltering morning of the 4th of August, 1892, the simmering tension exploded into deadly violence. Abby Borden was discovered in an upstairs guest bedroom, her skull crushed by repeated hatchet blows that left her nearly unrecognizable. Less than 90 minutes afterward, Andrew Borden was found downstairs, having suffered a similar savage attack while napping on the family couch. Lizzie's voice echoed throughout the house as she summoned the household maid. "Father's dead. Somebody came in and killed him," but suspicion immediately centered on her. Investigators documented numerous contradictions in Lizzie's statements and noted the complete absence of evidence suggesting forced entry. A blood-stained hatchet was located in the basement with its wooden handle conspicuously removed. Several days later, Lizzie incinerated a dress she claimed bore paint stains. Action prosecutors argued, represented a desperate attempt to eliminate incriminating evidence. Her trial the following year mesmerized the entire nation. Prosecutors presented circumstantial evidence, including Lizzie's hostile relationship with her stepmother and her alleged attempt to purchase poison the day before the brutal killings. The defense team argued that no blood was found on Lizzie's clothing, no eyewitnesses existed, and no definitive murder weapon had been conclusively identified. In a shocking courtroom spectacle, the actual skulls of Andrew and Abby were displayed as evidence, causing Lizzie to collapse in apparent shock. After merely 90 minutes of jury deliberation, she was declared not guilty of all charges. Public sentiment, however, remained sharply polarized. While many viewed her as an innocent woman wrongfully persecuted, others firmly believed she had escaped justice due to her gender and elevated social status. Lizzie spent her remaining years in Fall River, enduring social exile and whispered accusations until her death in 1927. The murders were never officially solved, and wild speculation continues more than a century later. The infamous children's rhyme immortalized her story. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. Yet historical records document fewer actual blows and provide no definitive answers to the central question. The haunting mystery persists. Did Lizzie Borden successfully escape punishment for double homicide, or was she an innocent victim of America's earliest media-feeding frenzy? The truth died with her, leaving generations to wonder whether justice was truly served in the Fall River courtroom that day. The Borden case remains a masterclass in reasonable doubt, where circumstantial evidence and social prejudices collided with legal standards, creating one of the most enduring mysteries in American criminal history. Carol Ann Hatley. She was 42 years old when her name became forever tied to one of Phoenix, Arizona's most haunting family tragedies. Carol Ann Hatley shared a modest home with her elderly mother, 73-year-old Deborah Hatley. Their living arrangement had lasted less than a year, but the bond between them had always been turbulent. Deborah, by all accounts, was warm, maternal, and deeply committed to her children. Carol, however, had endured a more troubled adult life. Her years were marked by alcoholism, chaotic relationships, and frequent financial instability. The arrangement to live together was intended to help Carol regain stability. Instead, it became the backdrop for a deadly unraveling. Family members later revealed that the mother-daughter relationship was riddled with conflict. Heated arguments were common, often worsened by Carol's heavy drinking. Relatives confided that they feared for Deborah's safety, though there were few recent police reports documenting violence in the household. Still, there was a sense of unease, an unspoken belief that one day, something terrible might happen. By the summer of 2012, Carol's dependency on alcohol had worsened. On the 30th of July, 2012, the situation reached its breaking point. In the early morning hours, Carol approached a neighbor in a haze, telling them her mother had died and she needed assistance. Police arrived quickly and entered the Hatley residence. Inside, they made a chilling discovery. Deborah's lifeless body lay in the home, partially wrapped in plastic bags, as if Carol had begun preparations to conceal the crime. At first, Carol claimed she had intended to take her mother to the hospital, but was overwhelmed. Investigators found her explanation implausible. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence pointing to an intruder, and Carol herself was visibly intoxicated. More troubling, detectives learned that Carol had waited hours before seeking help, even as her mother lay dead in the home. Her interviews with police were riddled with contradictions. Sometimes she spoke in vivid detail about what she had seen. Other times, she denied knowing anything. The inconsistencies, combined with forensic findings and testimony from relatives about her volatility when drinking, painted a damning picture. That very day, Carol was arrested on suspicion of second-degree murder. In April 2013, she accepted a plea deal, admitting her role in Deborah's death. The court sentenced her to 22 years in prison. The courtroom atmosphere was one of profound grief. Relatives wept not only for Deborah, whose life had been senselessly taken, but also for Carol, whose self-destruction had now claimed her freedom. Justice had been served, yet closure remained elusive. Psychologists later pointed to the likely causes: years of strained family dynamics, compounded by substance abuse and unchecked emotional instability. This was not a sudden act of madness, but the product of long-simmering dysfunction. As the judge pronounced her sentence, a haunting question lingered in the air. Could this catastrophe have been prevented if intervention had come sooner? Dolores Jean Eggert. Jean Eggert was 50 years old when she confessed to one of Washington County's most disturbing homicides, the murder of her own mother, 70-year-old Pauline DeVore. On the outside, the DeVore family appeared to live a quiet, rural existence on their expansive farm in the heart of Arkansas countryside. But beneath the surface, their home was fractured by bitterness, rivalry, and secrets too heavy to carry. Dolores, Pauline's adult daughter from a previous relationship, had lived through years of personal instability, financial strain, and fractured family bonds. Her connection with her mother was anything but simple. Friends described Pauline as strong-minded and firm, while Dolores had a reputation for volatility and conflict. Investigators later uncovered an even more disturbing layer. Dolores had been involved in a sexual relationship with her stepfather, Bob DeVore, Pauline's husband. This revelation cast new light on the family's dysfunction, a volatile household where resentment, betrayal, and secrecy clashed like live wires. On the 14th of June, 2007, the storm inside the family finally erupted. Dolores lured Pauline to an isolated area on the farm. There, she pulled the trigger, shooting her mother dead. To hide what she had done, she set fire to Pauline's body, reducing her remains to ash and fragments. In an effort to mask the crime, Bob reported the next day that their house had been burglarized, claiming firearms had been stolen while he was away. For nearly 2 years, Pauline's disappearance remained an unresolved mystery. Authorities suspected foul play, but no evidence tied anyone to the crime. Then, in 2009, the case broke wide open. A woman who had helped Dolores after the murder came forward, deciding at last to cooperate. She guided detectives to the burn site on the family property, where they uncovered charred bone fragments and dental crowns, conclusively linked to Pauline. Investigators also secured recorded conversations where Dolores openly admitted to burning evidence and even hinted at discarding portions of her mother's remains into a nearby river. With that, the walls closed in. She was arrested in April 2009 and charged with capital murder. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Facing the possibility of life without parole, Dolores ultimately struck a deal. In 2010, she pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, receiving a 30-year prison sentence. Bob DeVore, her stepfather and alleged accomplice, was convicted separately for staging the burglary scene and attempting to cover up the crime. He received 10 years behind bars. Prosecutors argued that Dolores acted out of resentment and self-preservation, fearing both exposure of her theft from her mother and the collapse of her relationship with Bob. Psychologists who reviewed the case pointed to years of manipulation, dysfunction, and emotional instability as contributing factors. Even today, Dolores has never fully explained her decision to murder her own mother. For Pauline's extended family and friends, grief was compounded not just by violence, but by silence. So much of the truth was reduced to smoke and ashes, along with Pauline herself. The haunting question remains: how does a bond meant for love and protection collapse into betrayal, brutality, and fire? Patricia Colombo. She was just 19 years old when she became both the only surviving member of her household and the prime suspect in their brutal murders. Born in 1956, Patricia Patty Colombo grew up in Elk Grove Village, Illinois, in what appeared at first glance to be a picture-perfect suburban family. Her parents, Frank and Mary Colombo, worked diligently to provide their children with comfort and stability. Patty, their firstborn, was admired for her striking looks and was well liked at school. Yet beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary family, a storm was brewing. When her younger brother, Michael, was born, friends noticed a shift in Patty's demeanor. She seemed increasingly jealous and resentful, interpreting her father's attention to the new baby as neglect toward her. The resentment quietly grew. By the time she was 16, Patty's life had veered onto a darker path. While working at a local coffee shop, Patty met Frank DeLuca, a married pharmacist nearly twice her age. Their affair quickly spiraled into an obsession. DeLuca, who had a wife and 5 children, was almost 20 years older than her, a relationship that horrified Patty's parents. Frank and Mary were vocal in their disapproval, leading to frequent arguments. Her father's disdain for DeLuca even turned physical during a confrontation. The conflict drove Patty away from her family and into DeLuca's arms, severing the last fragile bonds between them. On the night of May 4, 1976, the fracture became fatal. Patty and DeLuca entered the Colombo family residence, armed with a handgun and improvised weapons. Inside, they unleashed carnage. Frank and Mary were both shot and bludgeoned, while 3-year-old Michael was also slaughtered in the attack. The crime scene spoke of sustained fury, not just a quick execution. It was personal, violent, and drenched in rage. The quiet suburb of Chicago was stunned, 3 lives extinguished, and only Patty remained alive. She presented herself to police as bewildered and grieving, even suggesting her family might have been targeted by organized crime. But investigators quickly became suspicious. Patty's lack of genuine sorrow, her strangely detached behavior, and her eagerness to point the finger elsewhere raised alarms. As detectives dug deeper, the truth emerged. For months, Patty had tried to recruit others to kill her family. She had drawn detailed sketches of her home to help potential killers navigate. When her recruitment schemes failed, she and DeLuca carried out the murders themselves. Witness statements, forensic evidence, and DeLuca's eventual confession tied her directly to the crime. In 1977, both Patricia Colombo and Frank DeLuca were convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder. They each received staggeringly long sentences, 200 to 300 years in prison, a legal way of ensuring they would never walk free again. Over the decades, Patty has stood before the parole board multiple times, pleading for a second chance, citing her rehabilitation and good conduct. Yet each attempt has been met with passionate opposition from relatives of the victims and the very investigators who once worked her case. They argue that the premeditated, cold-blooded nature of the murders makes her unfit for release. What, then, drove a teenage girl to annihilate her own bloodline? Was it reckless infatuation with an older man? Was it envy? Or simply the intoxicating grip of rebellion? Patty Colombo has never fully answered that question. And perhaps, for the families left behind, no explanation could ever erase the horror of that night. Amber Mary Bray. She was just 18 years old when she became the central figure in one of California's most shocking family murders. On paper, Amber Mary Bray looked like the definition of promise. A former honor roll student and a cheerleader, she had been raised in Burbank by her mother, Dixie Lee Hollier, a successful Warner Brothers record executive. Their lives outwardly reflected the hallmarks of suburban success. But behind their front door, tension brewed. Amber's relationship with her mother was fraught with frequent arguments and unresolved resentment. By late 1995, Amber had grown increasingly rebellious and soon became infatuated with Jeffrey Ayers, a 21-year-old high school dropout who matched her defiance with his own. Their romance was all-consuming, isolating Amber from her peers and family. The two exchanged countless letters, filled with fantasies of a future together. But hidden within those romantic promises were sinister discussions about funding their new life through Dixie's $310,000 life insurance policy. In those letters, prosecutors later revealed, the pair outlined what amounted to a step-by-step playbook for murder. They detailed how to stage a break-in, carry out the killing, and vanish undetected to begin anew with a house, a car, and money. On the night of the 16th of January, 1996, their fantasies turned into horror. Amber deliberately left the door unlocked for Jeffrey. Armed with a revolver and kitchen knives, he entered the Hollier home as Dixie slept. The attack was frenzied and violent. Amid the chaos, Amber's younger sister, 15-year-old Amy, woke to the sound of the struggle and tried desperately to call 911. Amber, instead of helping, ripped the phone cord from the wall, ensuring no rescue could come. The neighbors, hearing gunshots and commotion, alerted authorities. By the time officers arrived, the nightmare was already complete. They found Jeffrey straddling Dixie's lifeless body, his hands raised in surrender. Both Amber and Jeffrey were arrested immediately. Initially, Amber tried to minimize her role, portraying herself as a passive bystander. But investigators discovered the damning letters between her and Jeffrey, proof that she had been an active architect in the plot. During trial, prosecutors painted Amber as the driving force behind the conspiracy, motivated by greed and a desire to escape her controlling home life. The defense countered, portraying her as a vulnerable teen manipulated by Jeffrey, desperate for love and freedom. But the jury was not swayed. Both Amber and Jeffrey were convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy. In 1998, Amber was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was stunned. For many who had once seen her as a bright, well-behaved student, the image of her as a cold, calculating conspirator was almost impossible to reconcile. The tragedy left behind questions that echo to this day. Was Amber truly driven by greed, or was she simply a lost teenager clinging to a toxic relationship? Was this a rebellion against her mother's authority, or the ultimate act of desperation to control her own destiny? Whatever the answer, Amber's life became permanently defined by the events of that winter night. Once a young woman with endless potential, she now serves a lifetime behind prison walls, remembered not for who she could have been, but for the family she destroyed. Virginia McCulloch. When police finally forced their way into a modest residence in Chilsford, Essex, in 2023, they uncovered a scene that could have been pulled from a nightmare. Inside, hidden away behind sealed rooms and suffocating stench, were the decomposed remains of John and Lois McCulloch, both well into their 70s. Forensic testing revealed the horrifying truth: John and Lois hadn't died recently. They had been murdered years earlier, in 2019, and the killer wasn't a stranger. It was their own daughter, Virginia McCulloch. For years, Virginia had been described as strange, unpredictable, even unstable. Neighbors recalled her as withdrawn, with wild mood swings, but no one imagined the dark reality concealed within her home, that 2 bodies had been entombed there for nearly half a decade. The revelation stunned the UK, quickly becoming one of the most grotesque and macabre family murders in modern British history. Detectives pieced together the timeline. Virginia had first poisoned her father, John, in 2019. Soon after, she turned on her mother, Lois, stabbing her multiple times in a brutal attack. But rather than contacting authorities, Virginia began an elaborate charade. She wrapped the bodies, sealing them in what prosecutors later called makeshift tombs within the house. Then she carried on with her life as though nothing had happened. For the next 4 years, Virginia lived in a bizarre masquerade. She told extended relatives that her parents were ill or unavailable, spinning excuses to explain why no one could see them. To outsiders, John and Lois seemed to have quietly retreated from the world. In reality, their corpses remained inside their own home, their daughter living among them. But Virginia's deception wasn't limited to secrecy. She plundered her parents' bank accounts, draining their pensions and savings. Investigators discovered she spent thousands, using their deaths to bankroll her own existence. This financial betrayal added yet another layer of cruelty to an already horrifying story. The scheme began to unravel when a concerned family member contacted authorities. In 2023, officers conducted a welfare check. The moment they entered, they were hit with the overpowering odor of decay. Behind sealed plastic barriers, they uncovered the truth: John and Lois had been murdered and hidden inside their own home. Veteran officers, hardened by decades on the job, described it as one of the most shocking crime scenes of their careers. Virginia was arrested immediately. She tried to claim she had been protecting her parents, but the forensic evidence told a different story. Toxicology confirmed John had been poisoned, while the deep stab wounds on Lois left no doubt of deliberate homicide. Her 2024 trial transfixed the nation. Prosecutors painted her as a cold, calculating woman who murdered not only for money but also for control. They argued she deliberately desecrated her parents' memory by hiding their bodies for years while she enriched herself with their savings. The defense countered by citing her history of mental illness, claiming she was overwhelmed by her parents' decline and detached from reality, but the jury was unmoved. The financial exploitation, the meticulous concealment of the corpses, and the years of lies proved she fully understood her actions. In March 2024, Virginia McCulloch was convicted of murdering both John and Lois. The judge condemned her crimes as grotesque beyond comprehension, sentencing her to life in prison with a minimum of 36 years before parole could be considered. At just 36 years old, the sentence all but guaranteed she will spend the rest of her life behind bars. The case seared itself into Britain's collective memory. Family killings are always shocking, but the sheer duration of Virginia's deception horrified even seasoned crime reporters. For John and Lois's relatives, the revelation was devastating. They had spent years wondering why they couldn't reach the couple, only to discover they had been dead all along, betrayed by their own daughter. Virginia's actions raise impossible questions. How does a daughter not only poison and stab her parents, but then live comfortably among their remains for years without guilt? Was it simply greed, or the product of something darker, a pathological resentment that consumed her entirely? Whatever the answer, the murders of John and Lois McCullough will forever stand as one of Britain's most chilling examples of familial betrayal. Today, Virginia sits behind prison walls, stripped of the very freedom she tried to buy with her parents' blood. The house has since been sold and scrubbed clean, but for those who remember, it will always be the place where a daughter chose to live side by side with death. Eudenia Rodriguez. Eudenia Rodriguez was 40 years old when an explosive confrontation with her mother spiraled into an irreversible act of homicidal violence that would destroy an entire family. Born in Cuba and raised throughout the United States, Eudenia's existence was characterized by chronic instability and emotional turmoil that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Her mother, Sonia Santiesteban, had weathered decades of unimaginable hardship to maintain her family's unity against overwhelming odds. As a single mother who had successfully escaped an abusive marriage that threatened her safety, Sonia raised her children while laboring exhausting hours as a domestic housekeeper, and later dedicating herself to caring for her beloved grandchildren. Those children were not hers through biological birth, but rather through deliberate choice and unconditional love. She had legally adopted them after her son and their biological mother permanently lost custody due to their inability to provide adequate care. By 2013, Sonia was wheelchair-bound, following a devastating workplace injury, residing in a modest mobile home within Miami-Dade County, where every sacrifice she made was specifically for the children under her protective care. Eudenia, however, struggled tremendously with life's basic challenges. Family members later disclosed that she maintained a documented history of severe emotional instability and untreated mental health disorders, though she consistently refused to receive professional treatment. The reasons behind her decision to move back into her mother's cramped home remain unclear, but household tensions escalated rapidly once she arrived. Living within such confined quarters, their relationship deteriorated under the crushing weight of accumulated resentments and unspoken grievances that had festered for years. On the 6th of October, 2013, that fragile peace finally shattered completely. Sonia made the difficult decision to ask her daughter to vacate the home permanently, a confrontation that ignited an explosive and volatile reaction from Eudenia. Eyewitnesses reported that Eudenia violently shoved her defenseless mother, who was completely unable to protect herself due to her disability, and then struck her repeatedly with her fists. When Sonia's 15-year-old granddaughter attempted to contact emergency services for help, Eudenia allegedly prevented her intervention, slapping the terrified girl across the face and forcibly removing the telephone from her hands. Moments later, she armed herself with a sharp kitchen knife and launched a vicious attack against her mother directly in front of the traumatized teenager. Police officers arrived shortly afterward, alerted by concerned neighbors who had heard the girl's blood-curdling screams echoing through the mobile home park. Eudenia was immediately apprehended at the crime scene and formally charged with second-degree murder, along with additional charges of child abuse and witness tampering. Her initial court appearance shocked all observers present in the courtroom. She appeared completely disoriented and confused, repeatedly interrupting the presiding judge, vehemently denying her mother's death had occurred, and even falling asleep during critical portions of the legal hearing. The judge immediately ordered a comprehensive psychological evaluation to determine her mental competency. The tragedy attracted widespread media attention throughout Miami-Dade County, not solely because of the brutal family dynamics involved, but because Sonia had been universally recognized for her extraordinary compassion, adopting her grandchildren to spare them from the foster care system, and depending heavily on her church community for emotional and financial support. Now, those same innocent children found themselves completely without the only stable parental figure in their young lives, placed under the temporary care of their church pastor, while family court determined their permanent placement. Prosecutors characterized the crime as the inevitable culmination of years of unresolved mental health struggles, combined with toxic family tensions that had been building toward this violent explosion. Eugenia's absolute refusal to cooperate with police investigators and her increasingly erratic courtroom behavior left many legal observers questioning whether untreated psychiatric illness, deep-seated resentment, or complete desperation had driven her murderous actions that fateful day. In the end, one haunting question continues to reverberate through this tragic case. When a devoted mother sacrifices absolutely everything for her children's welfare and happiness, what psychological forces could possibly lead one of them to turn against her with such savage violence? And can any explanation ever adequately make sense of such a devastating and senseless loss of human life and family bonds? Susan and Christopher Edwards. In the tranquil village of Mansfield, England, an ordinary suburban residence harbored a nightmarish secret for over 15 years. Buried beneath the meticulously maintained garden, concealed under multiple layers of soil and blooming flowers, lay the decomposing remains of William and Patricia Wycherley. They had been executed by gunfire and interred in May 1998, yet nobody harbored the slightest suspicion. For a decade and a half, their own daughter, Susan Edwards, and her spouse, Christopher, survived by stealing their victims' pensions, fabricating correspondence, and forging their signatures, perpetuating the elaborate deception that the Wycherleys remained among the living. When the horrifying truth finally emerged in 2013, it sent shockwaves throughout the entire nation. Susan, the seemingly mild-mannered daughter, had actively participated in orchestrating the ruthless execution of her own flesh and blood. Susan Edwards defied every stereotype of a homicidal maniac. She was introverted, intellectual, consumed by an unhealthy fixation with vintage Hollywood cinema and celebrity memorabilia. Her husband, Christopher, mirrored her antisocial behavior patterns. United, they constructed a bizarre realm of delusion and complete social withdrawal, hemorrhaging money they didn't possess on movie star autographs and collectible trinkets. Financial resources were perpetually scarce, and in Susan's twisted mind, her parents embodied both a source of ongoing friction and a potential goldmine waiting to be exploited. During 1998, while visiting her parents' residence, the family dynamic shattered beyond any hope of repair. According to Susan's subsequent testimony, a heated confrontation exploded without warning. Her father, William, allegedly hurled vicious insults regarding Susan's childlessness. He ridiculed her relationship with Christopher, mocking their entire marriage as a pathetic joke. That verbal altercation escalated into lethal violence with terrifying speed. Prosecutors contended that Christopher squeezed the trigger, executing William and Patricia within their own bedroom sanctuary. Susan, regardless of whether she personally fired the fatal shots, was an integral component of the homicidal conspiracy. She assisted in wrapping the corpses and excavating the makeshift graves in their backyard garden. The subsequent cover-up operation was absolutely meticulous in its execution. Susan and Christopher composed counterfeit holiday greetings, dispatched fraudulent letters supposedly authored by the deceased Wycherleys, and maintained casual conversations with unsuspecting neighbors about how the elderly couple cherished their solitude. They informed anyone who inquired that William and Patricia had relocated to the seaside for their golden years. For 15 uninterrupted years, this elaborate deception remained completely undetected. Throughout this period, Susan and Christopher systematically drained every penny from the Wycherleys' financial accounts. They rerouted pension payments, government benefits, and even secured loans using the dead couple's identities. Their total theft exceeded £250,000 sterling. This stolen fortune funded their obsessive collections of celebrity memorabilia, photographs, autographs, and worthless trinkets that held more value in their deranged minds than the human lives they had buried beneath garden soil. For more than a decade, absolutely nobody suspected the horrifying reality. The Wycherleys had been elderly recluses by nature. It proved remarkably simple for the Edwards to maintain the illusion that the couple had simply vanished into obscurity. However, in 2012, mounting financial difficulties began closing in around them. Their accumulated debts spiraled out of control, while their stolen money supply dwindled rapidly. In 2013, Susan made a catastrophic decision that would unravel everything. She contacted her stepmother, residing in France, confessing that her parents lay buried beneath the garden soil. Her stepmother immediately alerted the authorities without hesitation. British police investigators excavated the Mansfield garden, and their discovery sent shockwaves through the community. Two perfectly preserved corpses, lying side by side beneath the colorful flower beds, exactly where Susan had described. Susan and Christopher attempted to escape justice by fleeing to France, but within several weeks they voluntarily surrendered at the UK border crossing. During intensive police interrogations, Susan acknowledged her participation in the burials, but claimed she had been psychologically manipulated by Christopher. She insisted she was trapped within an abusive, controlling marriage and had acted purely from terror. Christopher, predictably, redirected blame back toward Susan. Their 2014 trial became a national media circus. Dubbed The Mansfield Murders, and later transformed into the television drama series Landscapers, the case revealed the disturbing psychology driving this married couple. Prosecutors characterized them as completely delusional, utterly selfish, and consumed by greed. Two individuals who valued material possessions and fantasy worlds more than human existence itself. The Edwards case stands as a chilling reminder that evil can lurk behind the most ordinary facades, and that sometimes the greatest monsters are those who smile and wave from their garden gates while human remains decompose just feet beneath the surface. Nicole Nachman. The peaceful suburbs of Tampa, Florida, were forever changed in August 2015 when one of the most shocking family annihilation cases in modern American history unfolded. 21-year-old college student Nicole Nachman systematically executed both her mother and stepfather in a brutal act of domestic terrorism. The savagery of the crimes, combined with her stone-cold demeanor throughout the legal proceedings, secured her position among the most notorious matricidal killers in recent memory. Nicole was the biological daughter of Miriam Delio, a temperamental mother infamous for her authoritarian and suffocating parenting approach. Friends and relatives consistently described Miriam as domineering, someone who demanded absolute perfection from her daughter in every aspect of life. She controlled Nicole's existence with military precision, particularly focusing her attention on Nicole's academic performance. Nicole was attending Florida State University, but she battled severe depression and profound social alienation. Those familiar with the family dynamic said she appeared completely overwhelmed by her mother's relentless pressure and constant criticism. Her stepfather, Robert DeLeon, known to everyone as Bob, was a decorated retired Navy captain who commanded respect throughout their community. He was remembered as disciplined, methodical, and uncompromising in his expectations. Together, Miriam and Robert embodied the authoritative figures that Nicole had grown to despise with every fiber of her being. To Nicole, their family home wasn't a place of comfort and security. It was a maximum security prison where her every move was monitored and judged. By the scorching summer of 2015, Nicole's deep-seated resentment had metastasized into murderous rage. Prosecutors would later detail how years of feeling imprisoned, humiliated, and micromanaged had finally erupted into homicidal violence. On the fateful evening of the 20th of August, Nicole returned to her mother's residence in Tampa, carrying a loaded firearm with lethal intent. Her stepfather, Robert, became the first target of her fury. According to the prosecution's case, Nicole approached him from behind, raised the weapon, and fired a single shot into the back of his skull. He dropped immediately, deceased before his body struck the floor. Moments later, she confronted her mother in what would become the most chilling part of this family massacre. Miriam let out terrified screams and desperately pleaded for her life, but Nicole demonstrated absolutely no mercy or hesitation. She discharged multiple rounds into her mother's body, ending her life within the confines of their own home. The crime scene photographs later displayed in court revealed the absolute brutality of the attack. Robert had been executed with military-style precision. Miriam's body was riddled with bullet holes from the sustained assault. When police officers responded after concerned neighbors reported the sound of gunfire, what they discovered was bone-chilling. The lifeless bodies of both parents lay scattered throughout the home. There were no indications of forced entry, no evidence suggesting a robbery attempt. It became immediately obvious that this was an inside job orchestrated by someone with intimate knowledge of the household. Suspicion fell on Nicole almost instantly. Detectives located her and transported her to the station for intensive questioning. Her initial statements contained numerous contradictions and inconsistencies. She fluctuated between claiming she had been present during the shootings and then completely denying any involvement. At one critical moment, she admitted she had simply lost control of herself. The subsequent trial attracted nationwide media attention. Nicole, a seemingly ordinary college student with absolutely no previous criminal history, now faced 2 separate counts of first-degree murder. Prosecutors constructed a compelling narrative of motive and malice. Nicole harbored intense hatred for her parents' oppressive control over her life. She desperately wanted freedom from their authority, and she concluded that double murder was the only viable solution to achieve it. They characterized the killings as calculated, deliberate, and completely without mercy. Shooting Robert execution style in the back of the head, they argued, demonstrated premeditated intent to kill. Pumping multiple bullets into Miriam's body revealed uncontrolled rage and a determination to ensure death. The defense team attempted to construct an alternative narrative. They highlighted Nicole's extensive struggles with mental health issues, particularly severe depression and social isolation disorders. They argued that she had endured years of psychological abuse, living under the oppressive thumb of an overbearing mother. They claimed she acted during a complete mental breakdown, not from calculated malice. Expert psychiatric witnesses testified about her fragile psychological condition, but the jury remained unconvinced. The sheer brutality of both killings, combined with evidence that Nicole had deliberately armed herself with a loaded weapon and systematically executed her stepfather before turning the gun on her mother, completely undermined any claims of temporary insanity or diminished capacity. In 2019, Nicole Nachman was convicted on both counts of first-degree murder. The presiding judge sentenced her to life imprisonment without any possibility of parole. She was merely 25 years old when she was escorted in handcuffs to begin a lifetime of incarceration. The aftermath of the trial left the entire community in stunned disbelief. Neighbors who had known Robert and Miriam for years expressed their complete shock and confusion. Friends of Nicole voiced amazement that the quiet, reserved young woman they remembered could commit such savage acts of violence. Yet throughout the court proceedings, Nicole displayed virtually no outward signs of remorse or regret. Her blank, emotionless facial expressions became a central part of the media narrative, reinforcing the prosecution's portrayal of a daughter who coldly eliminated her parents without a trace of human empathy. What makes Nicole Nachman's case so deeply disturbing isn't just the double homicide, but the domestic setting where it occurred. This wasn't some hardened street criminal committing violence in dangerous neighborhoods. This was a young woman from a comfortable suburban family, a university student who carried out calculated executions within her own childhood home. The concept that any daughter would murder not just one but both parental figures in such a methodical way struck at the very foundation of family relationships and social order. The case continues fascinating true crime enthusiasts because it raises profoundly uncomfortable questions about family dynamics and psychological abuse. Was Nicole genuinely a victim of sustained psychological torture who finally reached her breaking point? Or was she simply a selfish, entitled individual willing to commit murder to escape her mother's reasonable expectations? Regardless of the answer, the final outcome remained tragically the same. Today, Nicole sits in a Florida state penitentiary serving her life sentence without any hope of release. She will never experience freedom again. The Tampa home where the murders occurred has long since been sold to new owners. But for those who remember this case, it will always represent the site of an unthinkable family betrayal. Nicole Nachman chose violence over communication, murder over moving out, and in making that irreversible choice, she guaranteed that her name would be forever listed among the most evil daughters in criminal history. The echoes of gunshots that shattered her family that August night in 2015 continued to reverberate through true crime discussions, serving as a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest threat to family safety comes from within the family itself. Rachel Mullenix's dawn broke over Newport Harbor, California on the 13th of September, 2006, revealing a horrifying sight that would haunt investigators for years to come. Local fishermen made a spine-chilling discovery floating in the murky waters: a human body, meticulously wrapped in bedding and bound with industrial tape. When authorities retrieved the remains from the harbor's depths, the true extent of the savagery became apparent. The victim, identified as 56-year-old Barbara Mullenix, bore the evidence of an unthinkably violent end. Her body had been pierced more than 50 times with a blade. Her hands were restrained. She had been discarded like refuse into the cold waters. Initially, detectives theorized this might be a burglary turned deadly. Barbara resided in Huntington Beach, a prosperous seaside community where such violence seemed impossible. However, as the investigation deepened, the evidence didn't point toward unknown criminals or random attackers. Instead, it led directly to someone Barbara trusted most: her own 17-year-old daughter, Rachel Mullenix. Rachel's childhood unfolded in Southern California's comfortable middle-class neighborhoods. To casual observers, she appeared to be an ordinary suburban adolescent, bright, good-looking, seemingly destined for success. Yet, beneath the surface of their household, a toxic dynamic was slowly poisoning everything. Barbara had largely raised Rachel as a single parent, maintaining an iron grip on her daughter's life. Acquaintances would later characterize Barbara as overbearing and emotionally stifling. The pair clashed relentlessly. Barbara imposed strict curfews, monitored Rachel's every movement, and criticized her decisions at every turn. Their confrontations frequently erupted into screaming matches that shook the house. As 2006 progressed, the tension reached a breaking point. Rachel had become romantically involved with Ian Allen, a 21-year-old vagrant with a troubling background. Barbara loathed him with every fiber of her being. She viewed him as too mature, too unstable, and too threatening for her teenage daughter. She prohibited Rachel from maintaining any contact with him. In one desperate attempt to maintain control, Barbara actually imprisoned Rachel within their home to prevent her from meeting him. From Barbara's perspective, she was safeguarding her child. From Rachel's viewpoint, her mother had become a dictator. The bitterness grew like a cancer. Rachel craved independence. She yearned for Ian. And she began viewing her mother as the primary barrier to her happiness. According to the district attorney's office, this toxic resentment eventually crystallized into a murderous conspiracy. In the pre-dawn darkness of the 13th of September, Barbara faced an ambush within her own sanctuary. Ian Allen wielded a knife with deadly intent. Rachel was fully aware of what was about to unfold. The assault was absolutely savage. Barbara suffered more than 50 puncture wounds across her body. Her flesh was torn and shredded by the relentless attack. Many wounds showed defensive patterns, proving she had battled desperately to survive. Others were deep, deliberate thrusts into vital organs, revealing both fury and determination to kill. Following the slaughter, Rachel and Ian methodically wrapped Barbara's lifeless form in blankets, secured the bundle with duct tape, and forced it into the trunk of her vehicle. They traveled south toward Newport Beach, just a short drive from Huntington. Under cover of darkness, they hauled Barbara's corpse from the car and rolled it into the harbor waters. Perhaps they believed the body would disappear forever beneath the surface. Instead, it bobbed to the top, discovered within hours by horrified boaters. As investigators reconstructed Barbara's final moments, suspicion immediately focused on her daughter. Detectives observed Rachel's conspicuous absence from the scene. She had vanished completely. Days later, authorities learned that Rachel and Ian had stolen Barbara's car and fled California, racing eastward across the country. The cross-country manhunt concluded swiftly. Within 7 days, Louisiana State Police spotted the stolen automobile. After a dangerous high-speed pursuit, both suspects were captured. Rachel found herself at just 17 years old, sitting in a police cruiser, charged with her mother's murder. Back in California, the case dominated news headlines. A photogenic teenage girl accused of plotting with her older boyfriend to eliminate her mother captivated public attention. Journalists crowded the courtroom during Rachel's initial court appearance. Her behavior stunned observers. She shed no tears. She displayed no visible anguish. At moments, she seemed disconnected, even irritated, as if the proceedings were merely bothersome. Prosecutors portrayed her as calculating and heartless. They contended she wanted her mother eliminated because Barbara interfered with her relationship with Ian. They presented the jury with gruesome crime scene photographs, more than 50 stab wounds, blood splattered throughout the residence. They emphasized the methodical actions afterward, wrapping the corpse, disposing of it in the harbor, fleeing across multiple states. The defense attempted to redirect blame entirely onto Ian Allen. They characterized him as manipulative and violent, claiming he acted independently while Rachel was merely caught in his influence. They portrayed her as a frightened teenager exploited by an older predator. But prosecutors argued that Rachel was no passive observer. She was an active accomplice. She escaped with him willingly. She participated in concealing the crime. Throughout the trial, Barbara's relatives provided heart-wrenching testimony. They painted Barbara as a flawed but devoted woman who loved her daughter unconditionally, who labored tirelessly to provide for her family. None could fathom that her own child would betray her so completely. In 2008, justice was served. Ian Allen received a conviction for first-degree murder and a sentence of life imprisonment without parole. Rachel was found guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to 25 years to life behind bars. She was 19 years old when she learned she would spend decades in confinement. The verdict left the community reeling. Barbara's neighbors in Huntington Beach expressed their shock and disbelief. How could any daughter murder her mother so brutally, stab her dozens of times, then calmly drive away as if nothing happened? News outlets dubbed her the Harbor Killer. For the public, the image of a teenage girl helping dump her mother's body into dark waters became absolutely unforgettable. Even imprisoned, Rachel's story continues generating fascination. Some maintain she was manipulated by Ian Allen, that her youth made her vulnerable to coercion. Others argue she was equally culpable, pointing to her emotionless demeanor during interviews as evidence of her lack of genuine remorse. Today, Rachel remains locked away in a California correctional facility. She will eventually become eligible for parole consideration, but her identity is permanently connected to one of Southern California's most disturbing matricides. What makes Rachel Mullinex's case so deeply unsettling isn't merely the violence, but the profound betrayal it represents. A daughter, barely 17, turned against the woman who brought her into this world. She chose infatuation with a troubled boyfriend over loyalty to her mother. In making that choice, She destroyed 2 lives forever. Barbara's brutally ended in harbor waters, and her own, condemned to decades behind prison walls. A teenage girl who should have been planning for senior year instead became a convicted killer. And the haunting image of her mother's bound, stabbed body floating in those dark waters ensures that Rachel Mullinix's name will echo through true crime history forever.